Welcome again to all who've just joined us. We will start in just a minute. Thank you. Hello again and warm welcome to you all. My name is Imad Karam. I am the Executive Director of Initiatives of a Change International, and it is my pleasure to moderate this conversation today. Just before we get started, a reminder that this session will be recorded, and also throughout the presentation and the Q&A, please feel free to ask questions and to make comments using the Q&A function, which you can find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Now, before I introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Shakiyla Smith, just a brief word about us for those who may be new to Initiatives of Change. We are a worldwide movement of people of diverse cultures and backgrounds who are committed to inspiring, equipping, and connecting change makers in the pursuit of a just and peaceful world. In IFC, we believe that many of the world's problems and their solutions are rooted in human nature. Fear, hate, greed, and indifference can lead to injustice, poverty, conflict, and environmental destruction. Yet, it is also in our human nature to be caring, courageous, and creative. The question is, can we live the change that we wish to see in others? If you would like to learn more about us, please visit our website, iofc.org, and also get in touch. And so with that, let me welcome and introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Shakiyla Smith. I've had the privilege of meeting Shakiyla first about 18 months ago when IFC International and the Fetzer Institute were in the process of co-creating an international trust building program, which we launched last year. And it's been a real pleasure working closely with Shakiyla as the Fetzer Institute representative on this important initiative. Shakiyla is currently the Director of Organizational Culture at the Fetzer Institute, where she leads efforts to foster a spiritually grounded, growth-oriented community of freedom. And community of freedom is the Fetzer way of describing the fellowship and the collective of the Fetzer staff, volunteers, and affiliates. Shakiyla is a scholar and a practitioner whose primary question is how we develop the individual, relational, and collective capacity to meet the demands of the 21st century. She has a master's degree in public health and a doctorate in adult education with a focus on organizational development. Today, Shakiyla will share with us some of the Fetzer Institute's experience of trying to foster an internal community of freedom and work culture that helps their fellowship live into their mission and core values of love, trust, authenticity, and inclusion, especially during these difficult times. So Shakiyla, without further ado, many thanks for being with us and for offering your input. Over to you, please.
Great, thank you so much for that warm introduction, Imad. And I'm so happy to be here talking with you all, and just also it's been a joy and an honor for me to be part of the trust building program and working so closely with initiatives of change staff and volunteers and community. So one of the reasons why I feel very joyful and happy to be speaking with you all about this conversation that we're going to be in today is because this has been a big part of my own personal inquiry as well as our community inquiry at Fetzer. This question of what is the role and practices of spiritual community in supporting the emotional, mental, and spiritual well-being of folks, especially during these very strange, ungrounding times that we're in. And also, what is the role of spiritual community in fostering love, trust, authenticity, and inclusion, which are our core values, as Ahmad mentioned. So, you know, we might hone in a little bit on trust today for the purposes of this conversation, but really all of those are related and they build on each other. So I have notes here because I get really excited about this. So I want to make sure that I stay on task and on target. But, you know, even though I'm the director of organizational culture at Fetzer and charged with holding some of these inquiries and questions, I can't claim to be an expert on spiritual communities or on building trust. But what I would like to offer you are some brief thoughts and maybe insights from our community that might remind you of something or that you already know, spark a new insight for you, or maybe even just offer some inspiration for you and your own community. So as part of that, I'll tell you a little bit about our community of freedom that Ahmad mentioned, and then also tell you a little bit about what we're doing during this pandemic time to foster our community, and then maybe end with just a little brief thoughts and insights about that, especially how I think it relates to enacting trust. But first, I wanted to start off by reading you a very brief statement. We are drawn into community by our shared experience that there is more to reality than the physical realm, and that this something more binds us to each other and to all that exists in a deeply interconnected, meaningful, and sacred way, and calls us to a life of love. So that statement comes from our theory of change, and it's really a statement of our spiritual common ground that we seek to explore and live into as a community of freedom. And it really is the ground and deep intention beneath our community of freedom. So our mission at Fetzer is helping to build the spiritual foundation for a loving world. And very similarly to initiatives of change, we really believe that we have to be the change that we want to see in the world. So you don't force others to do work that you're not willing to do yourself, right? It's the same thing with trust, that there's this idea that not only do you have to extend trust to people, but you also have to be trustworthy, right? But in order for us to really live meaningfully into our mission and our core values, and even that grounding purpose statement that I just read, we embarked on an intentional journey to create and function as a spiritually grounded community of freedom. So I just want to talk a little bit about what that means for us. And that community of freedom language is what we call our internal community, but that term comes from the founder, John Fetzer, and he talked about it. He's no longer with us, but he wrote about it very expansively and purposefully, I think, didn't define what it was. So I think, you know, he sort of left it open for us to kind of explore and figure out what that means. So in 2013, about 8 years ago, when our new president, Bob Boyster, joined us, we really embarked on a journey to figure out what it means to be a community of freedom. And so what that looked like was we started a structure where every week for 3 hours, right now it's Tuesdays from 9 to 12 p.m., all staff, all 60 staff at the Institute, from the cooks in the kitchen to the groundskeepers to the program team to senior leadership or the finance department, everybody comes together to engage in personal and communal spiritual exploration together. And we all come from diverse spiritual paths. We have Buddhists and Muslims and Catholics and, people who don't practice any spiritual tradition, all together trying to live into what does it mean to be a community of freedom, or what does it mean to be, build a beloved community in some ways across all of these different experiences and perspectives that are rooted in these values of love, trust, authenticity, and inclusion. And so, it really has been a journey for us to explore that and what that looks like. What do those gatherings look like? Well, we usually start and end with an opening contemplative practice that a staff person will share. And a lot of times we have external facilitators or teachers who come to tell us about their tradition. Each year we have, as one example, each year we have a group of Christian monks who come talk to us about monastic living or other things. We've had indigenous grandmothers come to teach us about those traditions. We also have team building, trust building activities or exercises where we learn how to have difficult conversations with each other, storytelling exercises, a whole range of opportunities and experiences for us to really deepen into our individual and collective spiritual paths. And so, as you can imagine, over time, when you build community in that way, there is a sort of deepening that happens both individually, but also as a community, so that we don't just work together, but we really have an opportunity to know each other and hold each other at this very deep level. And so it's really been a time for deeper support and grounding and inquiry together, where we can explore all of these deep questions with each other. And I'll have some more insights to say about that, right? Because I don't want you to get this impression that it's just this this easy, beautiful thing, being in spiritual community together. And I think that has some implications for how you build trust in community too. But I wanted to just quickly say, this COVID time has been really challenging to that type of community because, we've been sheltering in place since mid-March as a community. So we've been separate. So what does that do to a community that's used to meeting together in person every week for 3 hours, right? And that doesn't even include, the work interactions. So what we've been doing is holding our community of freedom gatherings virtually, just 90 minutes because 3 hours is a lot to do. And they're much simpler structures than what we usually do. It typically involves asking a regular question that we repeat each week about, how are you and how is your heart, and then some other focus. And really, it's been a time for us to support each other, to feel into each other, and to really explore our values, especially the value of trust as we are separated from each other. In fact, our COO, we were having a full staff meeting about this whole working from home and COVID time, and he explicitly referenced our core value of trust and how it was going to be really important for us to live into that now, trusting that everybody was doing what they needed to do to take care of themselves and to do their work, that nobody was, being monitored because people weren't trusting that people were doing their work. And so, again, I just bring that up to say how, all of these 8 years of doing this deep work together has really enabled us during this very difficult time to not just say the words love, trust, authenticity, and inclusion, but to actually enact them in a real way. So I just want to close with some few thoughts about that too. Again, that being in spiritual community is really, we found, really critical to our own growth and spiritual path, right? Because oftentimes I think people think of spirituality as a very solitary thing, like it's in your faith, right? That this is your personal practice and behavior. But it also includes communities, and all of the traditions say this, right? Like the Buddhists talk about taking refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, or the teachings, and the Sangha, the community. We just finished Ramadan, and a big part of Ramadan is the congregational prayer and the gatherings at the mosques, right? So it's not just you, on your own praying. So clearly we need each other and we belong to each other. And if that is true, then things like, love, authenticity, inclusion, and trust are not only nice to have, but they're critical. And I would offer that what we've learned through our work at Fetzer is that they're not necessarily prerequisites to spiritual community, right? Like there's a way where we think you have to have trust to build community, which that is not untrue, but we've also found that community helps you build trust, and that community provides opportunities for you to build trust and enact trust, and really to practice all of these values that we have, not as these lofty platitudes, but as real on the ground work, work in spiritual practice. So I'll stop there, but I would like to just end with a reading from a spiritual teacher of mine about the work of relationship and community that might also frame our later conversation, and that maybe you can reflect on during the quiet time that's going to come. So maybe if people could just, if you aren't already, come into a very comfortable posture, and you can either lower your eyes or close them as I read these ending thoughts to you. That might be a good space to be in. So this is about being at the core of oneself with another. Being at the core of oneself with another is being present and at ease within ourselves, at home in a sense of ourselves, even as we are in the presence of another. It means that we continue to feel connected to ourselves and are aware of our own experience when in the company of others. We also learn to experience our capacity for being ourselves when with another through times of quietness, a sense of togetherness which arises from the deep stillness of just being. This sense of just being together is not so much a matter of me in active relationship to you, but an experience of union and beingness. Through all of these experiences, we begin to find a way of knowing and understanding ourselves and the world. In this way, we open to the other and deepen into our own beingness simultaneously. This is the basis for a true exchange of being through relatedness and forms the basis for the development of a deep intimacy in relationship. Thank you.
Thank you, Shakiyla. Thank you for your rich and inspiring sharing of some of the learnings and practices from the Fetzer experience, and in how we can look after the individual and the community at the same time, emotionally, spiritually, and practically, and how can we hold each other in the light, especially in times of crisis. In keeping up with the tradition of IFC, may I invite everyone to join us for a couple of minutes of quiet time in silence. You can reflect on what you've heard from Shakiyla. You can think about a question or comment. Please use the Q&A to put any questions or comments. And then I'll open the conversation, the questions and the conversations afterwards. Thank you. Okay, well, thank you again, Shakiyla. I'm happy to open the floor for questions. We have a few questions already posted on in the Q&A box or window. Feel free, everyone, to have a look and to add your own questions and comments. I'd like to invite Michael Smith in the UK to start, please. Michael.
Shakiyla, thank you very much for your remarks and for all that you're doing in partnership with Initiatives of Change to build this international trust building program. I'm wondering what your reflections are. I'm also a Smith, incidentally. I'm the author of books on the nature of trust that builds integrity, or integrity that builds trust in the economy, in business and the economy. And I'm wondering what you see are the ingredients of trust that build integrity. What are the actual ingredients of trust in your perspective?
Thank you. Yeah. Thanks for that question. I mean, I would be curious to hear what you think too, because I know you have so much experience with that. But I guess just what I would say to that, and again, I would love to have a conversation with people about this. From our perspective, both in just observing our community of freedom and, you know, my personal thoughts, and as well as just different convenings that we've held, I think I always like to say that the first thing about trust is really relationship. You know, that's the main thing. You know, we just did one of our community of freedom gatherings exploring this, and one of the things that came out was that trust is really this very multifaceted term. Like, there was first or included a lot of components, like one, trusting in the ground of a divine presence and mystery or the goodness of the universe. So there's like the first layer of trust that people have. And that there was also this notion of trusting in oneself, that you can't really trust other people if you don't have a foundation, again, of like a larger trust in oneself. And then being able to extend trust, or doing the hard work of extending trust to others. And then we talked a lot about doing the hard work of being trustworthy too, which was like an interesting thing too. Like, how are we trustworthy? So again, just to say that I think there's, we talk about trust, but there's a lot in there. But for me, the ground of that is relationship. And not even just not relationship is this sort of flowery way of thinking about it, but I keep going back to Martin Luther King's notion of beloved community and how you build trust in that way. And I was just reading about it earlier this week, and one of the things that struck me was, yes, he did talk about love, but he also talked about justice. And the importance of building beloved community, and I would say trust, through struggling together and dealing with transgressions. So that is sort of what I can offer, and I would love to hear what you think about that too in your experience.
Would you like me to respond?
Yeah, I would love to. I mean, you wrote a whole book on it. I'd love to hear what you think about it.
Do please, Michael.
Well, just a few remarks. A love for people, planet, and future generations. I think the 4 values, the 4 standards of initiatives of change are a very helpful basis for building trust. Honesty and integrity and purity of heart and motive, and selflessness, care for people, and a passionate sense for justice, and a sense of righteous anger too. There are things that it's quite legitimate for us to have a sense of righteous anger about. What happened to the African American who was killed by the police is absolutely outrageous, and they do need to be prosecuted. And we have political leaders in which we have very little trust at the moment. And I don't know how we deal with that other than voting them out of office. But I do feel that along with trust, there needs to be a passionate sense of justice and a passionate sense of righteous anger.
Yeah, thank you for that,
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Shakiyla. I'm just reminded of something from my colleague Rob Corcoran's book, Trust Building, where he says, trust is a fragile bridge that we build each day. So just to add that. Next, we have Keshab Dahal. Keshab, where are you and where are you based, and what's your question, please?
Thank you, Imad, and thank you, Shakiyla, for your insights. I'm Keshab, and I work with IFC Nepal, IFC India, and I'm asking this question from my home in Kathmandu, where I'm in strict lockdown for the 68 days today. And my question is, what are those elements that some spiritual communities are lacking or missing out in this generation, and therefore failing to serve the purpose that they are supposed to serve? And my question is coming from myself seeing a lot of spiritual communities being questioned, their leadership being questioned over time, that they are doing the work in the beginning, but eventually they fail to stick to the values that they were supposed to live by. And it is often difficult to even talk about spirituality sometimes in our parts of the world because of some kind of failures by some communities. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I mean, you know, that's a hard question to answer because I think it really depends on the community, but I'll answer it just based off of just different conversations. One, my thinking about our community, but also different conversations that I've had with other partners and people who are parts of spiritual communities. And there are two things that I've heard other people say, and one of whom is Richard Rohr, who's a Franciscan monk here in the States, who is the founder of the Center for Action and Contemplation, and he works mostly in a Christian context. But, you know, one of the things that I know he talks about is that he thinks that some of our spiritual communities, and this, he's very controversial, I will say this, for some people, not for everybody, but he argues that, that they are focusing too much on doctrine and not enough on sort of helping their community develop this sense of what he calls non-dual thinking, or being able to just grow and develop, right, in different ways. So I think that's interesting. And one of the other things that I've heard people talk about too, I'm thinking of another guy, a reverend who was at the Institute a couple of years ago, and he was saying in his community, and he runs a church, he was noticing that that the spiritual communities are not having a way to manage transgressions, or when transgressions happen. Again, like this notion that what Mike was talking about, a sense of justice, or when risks happen in the community, like how do you do the relational repair work, I think. So that's one perspective. What I would also offer, as I noticed has helped us, is how do spiritual communities not become calcified around certainty, right? But engage in inquiry together. Like, I'm a big proponent of inquiry and exploration and leaning into the not knowing and the mystery, and how we're all making sense of this individually and together. So I think those are just a few things. I just saw that that Keshab got disconnected. So, but hopefully that benefited others. Sorry.
Indeed, thank you, Shakiyla. Next, we have Ken Noble. Ken, please, your question.
Thanks, Shakiyla, for what you said. When I read your blurb before you started, I was quite struck by the phrase about fostering a spiritually grounded culture. And the question that went through my mind is that there are many forms of spirituality, and some of them are actually almost incompatible with each other. So I just wondered, in your work, what tests do you use to sort of evaluate spirituality and recognize what is, if you like, what is good spirituality and what is bad spirituality? That may not be language that everyone would agree with, but I personally believe there is good and evil, and that spirituality, in a sense, it can be either.
Okay, did you finish your question?
Yes.
Okay, great, thank you. I didn't want to interrupt you. Yeah, I think that is an interesting question, I think, because when we first started our community of freedom, I think a lot of staff had that question as well. Because, you have to remember, we aren't a religious organization. We're a workplace. So people were like, am I going to be like, are you going to be judging my spirituality, or am I going to get fired if I'm not, doing it right, in quotes. And so for us, it really was important we talk about spiritual common ground, which is what, and I think this is very much related to the trust building work that you all do, right? Like, how do you come from different perspectives and backgrounds and not necessarily seek to change the other, right? But find some kind of common ground that is the basis for authentic and sacred relationship. So I think that's what the question is, and that's the question for us. And I think it's a really important question, again, and what I love about working at Fetzer and being in this sort of larger inquiry is this is the question of the time, I think, and the question for society. So what we're sort of experimenting with in our organization is the larger experiment of, you're right, like some of them are going to be in conflict, and we still need each other and belong to each other. So what is the common ground when people have different belief systems? And I don't think it's anybody's job to say whether or not somebody's spirituality is good or bad. That was our stance that we had to be in, because then we start getting down this slippery slope, because again, we do have Muslims and Christians and Hindus and Buddhists and, people who practice indigenous traditions in our community, or people who don't practice anything that they would call within a tradition too. And how do we love and respect each other even within that? So what we have found is the question again for us is not what's good or bad spirituality, but what is the spiritual common ground that we can all meet on and be in practice around with each other, which it is hard. I'm not going to say that it's easy, because you're right, there are different people have different practices and things that they don't necessarily feel comfortable participating in. And so it has been a journey for us as a community to figure out what is that spiritual common ground. And I think one of the things that can ground us, and you all have this too, is to go back to your core values. So that's what we go back to, right? I have not found any tradition or even people who don't practice a tradition, right? They can all agree that love, trust, authenticity, and inclusion, even if those things mean different things to us, those are good things that we all want to enact as a community. So I think then you just start stripping away all of the other stuff and getting down to core values at that point, which again, I have not found any person or tradition that doesn't agree with that. But that's a really good question, and it comes up in our community all the time.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ken, for your question, and thank you, Shakiyla, for your response. Next, we have Talia Smith, who is the program manager for the International Trust Building Program. Welcome, Talia. What's your question, please?
Thank you, Imad. Thank you, Shakiyla. I just want to say how lovely it is to work with you. And it was so nice and interesting to find out more about how your community of freedom really works at Fetzer. So lots of insights for me. I was just wondering, what are the biggest challenges that you have experienced in building a spiritual community, and how have you maneuvered around them?
Well, yeah, thank you for that. And it's been a pleasure working with you too, Talia. Thank you for your question. I think some of it, I started getting into some of it just now, you know, with Kim's question, and that has really been a serious issue for us, and not in a bad way. I actually see it as a challenge, a good challenge, you know, like a positive challenge around how do we live in beloved community with each other when we don't all think the same thing, or when we don't all believe the same thing, or and that can be on so many different levels, not just spirituality, but you know, across race and age and all sorts of different perspectives. And so, you know, I think, although I would challenge this, because I've talked to some other more quote unquote homogenous spiritual communities, like, you know, communities that maybe are all Christian or all Muslim, and they even say that there's a variety of, you know, perspectives in those communities too, right? Like people still struggle with that. But I think there's a particular challenge for our community because we have so many different spiritual practices and belief systems that that we have had to figure out what is that spiritual common ground and how is it that we can be alone together, right? Because we're not trying to, we're not a religious organization, so we're not telling staff what they need to believe. I think that's not even legal actually in this country. So, you know, so we're actually skirting some really interesting things when you bring spirituality into the workplace, right? Like you have to be really careful about that. So, and we don't, you know, that's an ongoing inquiry for us that we have, that we just, you know, explore, and people get upset. Like we, it's not like it's all rosy, right? Like people get triggered by different things in the community. And again, that's part of building trust and growing together. So I think that's probably our biggest challenge, to just, how do you live in diverse spiritual and other community in a way that honors people's individuality and their individual paths, but that also supports the community. And I think it's a really beautiful, juicy question because, you know, if we can figure it out, then maybe we can have something to share with other people, because I think that's the question that everybody in the world is trying to figure out, right? How do we live together without destroying each other?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Shakiyla.
What a beautiful vision. Thank you, Shakiyla. And thank you, Talia, for the question. Next, we have Isaac Luria. Isaac, where are you based and what's your question, please?
Hi, everybody. Isaac Luria. I'm based here in Brooklyn, New York. And I think my question has also been covered in some ways by Shakiyla's comments, but I'll put it back out there just to say that, you know, there are opportunities and challenges that a radical pluralism like the one Fetzer is talking about. You know, and it can be hard. And I wonder if there are ways that you might be able to share, Shakiyla, some of the conflicts that have arisen within the community over how it's structured, maybe even in story, to help us understand how that has been worked with. So thanks very much.
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. Hello, Brooklyn. And I shared some of that. I won't necessarily repeat it, but we, just to give you a story or an example of how some of that stuff looks, you know, like I said, we bring in different guest teachers and speakers, and our community is very interested in learning about other traditions, you know, so, you know, we have professors come in and talk to us about the world religions, and then we bring in practitioners or spiritual teachers from those traditions. And one of the tensions or conflicts that come up, because we try to, you know, it's a 3-hour session, so we try to make them experiential. And, you know, that's a real challenge, because for some people, engaging in a spiritual practice that is outside of their tradition is not only uncomfortable, but for some, you know, they're not supposed to be doing that, right? So we've had to have these questions of, you know, how do we provide a space for people to learn about other traditions and practices while also not, it's invitational, not requiring that they do something they don't feel comfortable with, right? So that, I don't know that we've completely figured that out. Normally what we say is that everything is by invitation, and that people can opt out, not in terms of opting out of the session, but if somebody's inviting you to do a practice that you don't feel comfortable with, for example, you don't have to do that. So I think that's one of the ways that we've tried to provide space for people to opt in and out of different things. But again, we still have challenges that come up around that.
Thank you, Shakiyla. We've got about 10 more minutes, and I would like to include as many questions as possible. Next, we have Angela. Angela and Will. Elliott, please go ahead.
Thank you, Imad. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Ask your question, please, Angela.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Shakiyla, thank you for what you shared. At the beginning, you talked a bit about a session that you had dealing with how to have difficult conversations. I would love to learn a bit more about this, as this is something I struggle with. So if you have any tips, I'd be very grateful.
Well, I think I don't necessarily have any tips, but I will say that communication is one of the biggest, human actions, if you will. So learning how to communicate effectively is so critical. But one of the things that, because there are different, I guess, techniques or frameworks to help people with communication, and we've used a specific one at Fetzer. But just to say that really underlying it is this idea about having open and honest and respectful conversation. So one of the things that we have in our community is we have a very polite culture, is what we call it, a culture of politeness, which is partially regional because we're based in the Midwest part of the country, which has certain cultural values around politeness. And, it's been a real journey and practice for us as a community to learn how to have conflict, and disagreement in a way that is productive and generative. So a lot of our conversational practices or communication practices are about having open and honest and respectful communication, knowing that telling the truth and having honest conversation is kind. It's not necessarily mean to have open and honest conversation. So that would be the one thing that I would just say that we've learned and are practicing into around that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Angela, and thank you, Shakiyla. Next, we have Toufic Hakim. Thanks, Toufic, for joining us again. Please tell us where you are and what's your question to Shakiyla.
Thank you, Imad, and thank you so much, Shakiyla, for this inspiring presentation. It's wonderful to hear how a leader at your institute was able to bring you together and start developing this community of freedom. And that reminds me of the relevance and critical nature of effective leadership. I am in the US, not far from New York, in northern New Jersey, where, as we all know, we're experiencing an emergent culture that is maybe the polar opposite of what we'd like to see as a culture of love, trust, authenticity, and inclusion. So my question to you is a bit broader, but I'd like to hear your views as to how we can work with organizations whose leaders are not in touch with their spiritual core, with that spiritual dimension and its gentle power. How do we work with them and with their organizations to generate this culture of love, trust, authenticity, and inclusion? And thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks for that question. Yeah, so one part of my role is obviously focused internally at Fetzer, but then the other part of my time is spent thinking about how to connect with other organizations that are spiritually grounded organizations, doing this work and trying to figure out what are the best practices and structures and ways of being in community that foster this type of community. And I think there's an opportunity, you know, I also do some work with other organizations who are not quite there yet, but they are very much interested in functioning in a more spiritually grounded or mission-focused way. And it's not going to look like it does at Fetzer. I mean, you know, our president calls our Community of Freedom gatherings one of our largest programmatic investments. Because if you can think about an organization and having the entire staff take half a day once a week to do this, I mean, that's a huge sort of just like in-person hours, right? So not everybody is going to be doing that path, but I think in just my travels and talking with people, there are lots of organizations that are very interested in this. We commissioned a literature review from an organizational culture professor many years ago to look into workplace spirituality. And she identified lots of even for-profit organizations like Eileen Fisher and Xerox in the States who are doing really interesting work in that area, I think. And then I was also last year part of Flint, Michigan here in the States, where, as many people may have known, had the whole lead scandal that happened. Mm-hmm. They just launched a Mindful City initiative. And this was last year when they did this, and I got an opportunity to participate in a 2-day training of about 400 leaders across the city, including the mayor's office, wow, business leaders, educational leaders who did a whole mindfulness training to look at how they can bring more of these types of principles into their functioning. And I think they even have all of the schools, at least the elementary schools, doing mindfulness in the schools, which has been interesting. So just to say that there is a growing interest and movement in this, and we do have some partnerships and body of work portfolio that's related to workplace spirituality.
Yeah, thank you, Shakiyla.
Thank you, Toufic, and thank you, Shakiyla. Shakiyla, I would like to squeeze in a couple more questions if people could keep their questions brief, and if you can also give a brief response, please. And advance apologies for those who haven't managed to voice and will not manage to voice their question, but please, let's keep the conversation going also offline. So next, I'd like to invite Beth Bradford to ask her question, and tell us where you are based, please, Beth.
Hi, I'm sorry. I'm Beth Bradford. I'm based in Philadelphia. And I think communities are so important, but I would like to talk about the online community and how we can kind of inspire more of these, this idea of inquiry and curiosity rather than conflict into social communities in terms of trying to find a common ground. If you had any suggestions.
Yeah, I think that is a hard one, but that's a really great question. I think some of it is how do we create different spaces in organizations, which again is what I love about our Community of Freedom, in schools and other sectors, to help people just connect more, to develop more capacity for developing their inner life, you know, the inner life of the mind and the spirit in a way that allows them to take action in the world in a different way. And I think that's what Initiatives of Change is doing, and that's what we're trying to do at Fetzer too. So I think just any way that we can magnify that type of work in different sectors and institutions, I think would help that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Beth, and thank you, Shakiyla. And finally, I would like to invite Abuelgasim Awadalla to ask his question. Tell us where you are, please, and what's your question?
Yes, thank you, Brother Imad, and thank you, Shakiyla, for such an interesting topic. I'm Abuelgasim Awadalla. I'm from Sudan. Actually, yes, I like the introduction that you made, and I felt like the communities that you talked about, it looks similar to Sudanese community, what you call like community of freedom. My question is that how do you look at the spiritual values, teachings, especially in diversified communities like Sudan, to bring people together, focusing on connectors? I mean, the similar values after the COVID-19. And I think COVID-19 is an opportunity for some people like to work on their values and to have reflections. I think it's better to focus on connectors rather than the virus. Aiming that we need to bring trust. Yes. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, I think, I mean, yes, I would say, I mean, I don't know that I have anything extra to add to your commentary. I think that's a great way to go. And I guess I would just say, again, for me, trust, the basis or ground of trust, I guess this is a good way to end, right, is really relationship. So how do relationship and also helping people learn each other's stories, because it's really hard to hate somebody or to, you know, have challenge with them when you put yourself into their shoes. So, sorry, I had like something coming in and outside. So yeah, that's what I would say. What are the ways that you can create opportunities for people to share stories and develop relationships with each other? Get close to the other, if you will.
Thank you, Shakiyla, and thank you, Abuelgasim, for your question. I'm conscious that each question could have taken half an hour in a conversation, but we are limited with time. I'm grateful for everyone's presence, and especially Shakiyla for your inspiring input and rich also learning for us all. So thank you, Shakiyla, for that, and thank you, everybody. All is left for me to say to you is, please you will see in the chat box an invitation to support our work. We need your support. So if you feel moved to enable more of our work and trust building work to happen, please do give what you can so that we can do everything possible towards achieving our mission, towards a just and peaceful world. Thank you again. Please take care of yourself. Keep in touch, and you will be hearing soon from us about the next events. That's it from me. Thank you again, and goodbye, everyone. Thanks, Shakiyla.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you, everyone.